Yep. Hello, everyone. Is my voice audible, guys?
Yes.
Okay. So, have you guys gone through this context API? Anyone have any kind of doubts on this? Understood how to implement context API in your React application? Anyone, any doubts or any kind of confusion? Okay. So, let's take one more example on this context API. Let's assume that I have three components. I have component one, then I have component two, and let's assume that I have component three. Now, in my this component one, let's assume that we have one text box and we have one button. We have one text box and we have one button. Now, my requirement is whatever I will enter in this text box, whatever I will enter in this text box. Suppose I'm entering some content in my text box. And the moment I click on this button, this content I want to display inside this component. So in my parent component, I will have one text box and I will have one button. If I enter something in this text box and if I click on this button, this content we have to display inside this child component. So somehow you have to share the data from this component to this component. Okay. So for this, let me create components in that way. So I will go to this components folder under this context API. Here, let me create something called home context dot JSX. Let me create one simple component here. Something called home context. Here simply I will add and I will just say home context component. Inside this, I want to create one text box. So input type equals to text and then one button. Something like submit. And let me add simple placeholder here. Enter text. In the same way, let me create one more component here. For that, I am creating one more file, something called details.jsx. Using H2 and here like details component. And inside this, let me take some H4. And here I want to display the data. Okay, that will come. How to pass child to parent, that will come after some sessions. Now here I have details component. Okay, let me take only two component instead of three component. So our scenario will be like this. I will have two components. Here, let me add one text box and one button. Now, whatever content you will enter inside this text box, and if you click on this button, this content you have to pass to this component using context concept. We can go with props, but in this example, we want to use context concept. So whatever content you will enter in this text box, and once you click on this button, this text box content you have to display inside this component, So for this, I have to create parent-child relationship. So here I will import details component, and here I will render that details component. Let me go back to app.jsx. Let me import that home context, and let me render that component here. If I go back, here I got it. Now, whatever content I will enter here, the moment I click on this button, this content I want to display here. And this data, whatever data I have in my home component, that data I want to pass to details component using context concept. So what we have to do, the first step now here. This is how we have created our structure. Now, whatever you will enter here, if you click on this button, that data you have to display here. So what is the first step I need to do here? What is the first step I have to do?
Import create context.
Create the context.
So first step is I have to create context. Okay. First, let's create one simple context so that we can store some data inside that context. First, I need to create context. How to create context? How to create context?
By using create context method.
So what I will do, first of all, I will create one separate file, something like my home context.js file. I'm creating one JavaScript file with the name my home context. In this, I want to create context. So for that, first you have to import create context function from React library. Now simply you have to call this function create context. So internally one context will be created, and that context reference will be written. So we can hold that context reference in one of the variable. So here I am saying like my home context. Now this context I required in some other files. That is the reason I am exporting this context from here. So this time, instead of going with the default export, I will go with the named export. So I have exported this context from this file. So context is created. Now inside this context, we have to store the data from home component. From our home component, we have to store the data inside this context. So how can we store the data inside the context from our component? How can you store the data inside your context?
Provider.
Like, let's assume that this is your interview question. In your interview, your interviewer asking how to store the data in the context. So how will you reply? Anyone? Just think that you are in interview and this is the question you got. So let's assume that your interviewer is saying that I have a component, in that I have a text box and one button, and I have just created one context. Now my requirement is whatever I will type in the text box, that data I want to store in my context. How can I store in my context? Can you please explain? So how you will explain this? Answer.
By using provider and it text value.
Okay, what is provider?
For this, we can store the data inside the context. We have used provider.
But what is provider?
Predefined component.
The predefined component. Okay. So what you have to say is we can store the data inside the context using a predefined component called provider. Using a predefined component called provider, and that component we can access using the context. Using the context. So from which component you want to store the data in the context, in that component, you have to render provider component. You have to render provider component. That is the first step. And this component you can access. You can access using your context. Using your context. So the first step is you have to render this component inside the component from which you want to store the data inside the context. Right now, I want to store the data inside the context from home component. So inside the home component, I will go back to my home component. Here, I should render provider component. So to render that provider component, first you have to import your context. We have to import our context, and using this context, we can access that provider component. So here somewhere I am rendering provider component. This is the first step. Now this provider component takes one props, and the key name of that props is value. And to this props, I have to provide my data as a value. To this props, you have to provide your data as a value. So if you provide your data as a value, then this provider component will store that data inside your context. That data will be stored inside your context. Now the question is how you will pass the data of text box inside this provider, inside this props. Now you have rendered provider component inside your home context component. Now this provider component takes one props, that is value. Now whatever data you want to store inside this context, that data you have to add here. Now what data we want to add inside our context? We want to add the data of the text box. Whatever user will type inside this text box, that data we have to add here. Now the question is how you will add your text box data inside your context using value props. So basically you have to pass your text box data here. How you will pass that text box data inside this props.
First, we
Using
need
a
to
text
find the-
box ID or placeholder, right? Attribute IDs.
Here I have to take ID. Then let's assume that
Yeah.
here I have taken ID input subject.
Okay.
Then what I have to do?
Yeah, in value we got to assign input.
No, how can you assign directly input?
No.
We want the data of this text box, means whatever you are typing, right? Whatever you will type in this text box, this data somehow you have to pass here.
Okay. Input type.
Okay. So the question is how we can do that. Anybody have any solution? Think, guys, already we have done. Already we have completed the concept that is required to do this. You have to just think how you can use your concept to fulfill this requirement. How can you use your concepts to fulfill this requirement? Just think little bit. Just take 2 minutes of your time and think how I can pass my text box data to this props as a value. As a developer, your job is to pass text box data to this value props. Internally, provider component will take care of storing that data in the context. Yeah, tell me. Tell, it's okay. Even if you're wrong, it's okay. Yeah. Pardon?
We need to set using the set attribute or set state.
Nice. How can we do with this set state?
Yeah, we need to first create a state variable.
Nice.
Use state.
First, we have to create state variable. Let's assume that we have created one state variable. Okay. Then what we have to do after creating state variable?
We need to set the value in that set state.
Which value? Which value we have to set?
Input value.
So whatever data you will type here, that data somehow you have to store in this state. Okay. Then?
And then pass the state.
That's it. This is what we have to. Nice. So basically what we have to do here is, first we have to create one state. Now, whatever data you will type inside this text box, that data you have to store inside your state. So whenever you are typing something in this text box, that data we have to update inside our state. And this state somehow we have to give to the context. And when we have to pass, once we click on this button, then only this state data we have to store inside our context, or we have to give to this value props. So for that, what we are going to do is, first we have to create one state. So to create one state, we require use state. So here simply I am creating state, comma, set state equals to use state. State is ready. Now, somehow, whatever you are typing in this text box, that data we have to update inside our state. So how you will update the data of text box inside your state? Inside your state. How can you update data of this text box?
We need to call
Inside your
set
state. We have to, what we have to do?
call set state and that value.
How you will call set state? Okay, tell me, whenever we are typing something inside this text box, which event will trigger?
On change.
Nice. So whenever we are typing something in this text box, on change event will trigger. So whenever this on change event is triggered, I am just calling here one function. So whenever on change event will be triggered, this function will be called. Now we know that in JavaScript, to all our event handlers, we can pass one predefined object, and that is event object. And using this event object, you can access the data of this text box. So how to access the data of the text box using the event object? In JavaScript, we have spent our time on this event object, if you remember. While explaining the events concept, I have explained about this. To all our event handlers, we can pass one predefined object called event. And using that event object, we can get the access of current element, current DOM element. How to access the value of this text box using this event object?
Event.value.
Event.target.value, right? So for this, what I will do here, I will call my set state, and inside that I will pass event.target.value. So let me just go back here. Meanwhile, let me just add here empty string so that you will not have any error. Now, whenever I type any character here, for example, if I am typing yes, the moment I type yes, on change event will be triggered. So basically your change event will be triggered. That change event will be caught by this on change event listener. And whenever that change event got triggered, now this event handler will be called. And inside this, we are calling our set state. And inside that set state, we are passing the data of that text box. Nothing but here we are passing this yes character. Now what set state will do? That yes, it will update inside our state. It will simply update inside our state. So in the same way, if I do any kind of change here, for example, if I remove this yes, again, change event will be triggered. And whenever that change event is triggered, this function will be called. Whenever this function is called, internally this function will call set state. And inside the set state, what we are passing the current data of that text box. So right now we don't have anything. We have just removed this yes. So it's like a empty. So that empty data will updated inside your state. Nothing but your yes will be removed from your state. So whatever changes you will do inside this text box, that data will be updated inside your state. Now, if I click on this button, I just want to call one more function here, something like submit data. And that submit data, I will define here somewhere. And here simply I will add console.log and simply I will try to print my state value. Now, whenever you click on this button, submit data function will be called. And in that function, we have simply written the logic to print the value of our state. Now, if you go back to your browser, right click, open inspect, go to console. Now here, whatever I will type and click on submit, that data will be printed in my console. Now, if I remove this everything, just if I keep C and click on submit, only C is printed. If I remove that, C also, and if I click on submit, just empty data will be printed. So here, whatever you are typing, that data is updated inside your state. That is updated inside your state. So how you are updating that inside the state? Whenever you type or you do any kind of changes in your text box, change event will be triggered. That change event will be caught by onChange event listener, and this function will be triggered. And whenever this function is triggered, nothing but whenever this function is called, internally this function is calling set state. And inside this set state, we are passing event.target.values. What this event.target.value will do? It will just give us the data of current, basically it will give the current data of the text box. This line will give us the current data of the text box. That current data of the text box you are giving to your set state. Set state will update that data inside your state. So right now, whatever data we are typing in the text box, that data we are updating inside this particular state. Now, whenever we click on this button, this data somehow we have to give to the context. We have to give to the context. The data of this text box, we have to give to the context. How we can store that data inside the context? For that, we have to pass our state data to this value props. When we have to pass, once we click on the button, So now the question is, how you will pass your state data to this value props on click of this button. Anyway, how you will pass your state data to this value props on click of button. So for this, what we can do is we can create one more state.
Use context.
So here we have to create one more state. This state we have to pass to the value props. And whenever you click on that button, the data of this state, you have to copy inside this state. That's it. So what we can do here is we can create one more state here. Let data, comma, set data equals to use state. Now, whenever you click on this button, this function will be called. Inside this, I will write the logic to update my data with state value. and this data I will pass to my value props as a value. Now, if I go back here, so here we cannot see right now, but whatever you are typing here, and if you are clicking on this button, this data got stored in your context. Now, inside this component, we want to access the data of the context. So what we will do, we will go to that details component. Here simply we will import use context. Here we will import my home context. And then we will call this use context and we will pass our my home context. Now use context will return the data of this context. So that data you can store in some variable. And that variable we can bind here. Now if you go back here, and if you type something here and click on this button, now see here, we did not got the data. Let's see what went wrong.
We need to call that inside details component inside home context.
So we have called use context, my home context, we got the data, but data is not stored properly. Let's try. Here we
Here
got set data and we are passing set. That is right.
the
And
30th line should be in between, right?
yeah. So here what we have to do now, this details component, we have to render inside this provider component. Then only details component can access the data of context. Refresh. Now here I will type something. Click on submit. We got that data here. So if this details component wants to access the data of the context, then this details component should be rendered inside your provider component. So that part we were missing. Now here we got that details. So basically what we are doing here, you have this home context component. In this, you have one text box and you have one button. Now, inside this component, we are creating two states. So this is state 1, and then we have one more, that is state 2. We are creating two states. Now, whatever you will type in this text box, whatever you will do any changes or whatever you will type in this text box, that data we are updating inside this state. So when we are updating the data inside this state of the text box, the moment you do any kind of changes in the text box, at the same time only we are updating that data inside this state. So whatever data you will have in the text box, that data you will find inside this state. Now, once you click on this button, whatever data you have in this state, that data you are copying inside this next state. And this state you are giving to your provider component as a value props value. This state we are giving to value props as a value. So this is our data. This is our normal state. And here we have provider component, which takes one props, that is value, and whose value here we are passing this state. Which state? Data state. Data state. So inside this data, when this text box data will come inside this state, when text box data will come, if you click on this button, this state data we are copying inside this data state. And that data state we are passing to this provider component as a props. Now, provider component will take care of adding this data inside the context, And once the data is available in the context, then using use context, using this use context, we are accessing that data, and that data we are binding to our JSX element. So in this way, you got that data here. Now here, if I do any kind of changes, and if I click on this button, that data will be updated here as well. The data is updated here as well. Okay. Now I am giving you one assignment. Now my requirement is whatever I will type in this text box, anyways, that data I am updating inside my details component. I am passing to my details component. Now this data I want to pass to my nav component also. I want to pass to my nav component also. And somewhere here, I want to display that data. I want to display that data. Maybe here, I want to display this data in my nav component as well. So let me go back to nav component. Here, let's suppose we have some paragraph. And let me just display here Sagar, and let me check how it looks. Here, I want to display that data. In this paragraph, I want to display the data. So the moment I type here something and click on this button, now this data anyways you are displaying in the details component. Now same data I want to display in the nav component also. Now you have to think how you can pass the data from this text box to the nav component. Okay, that is your assignment. You have to think here a little bit. Yeah, any doubts in this task? Understood? First of all, how you have to pass the data from this form component to details component. So all the concepts, what we know, we have used only those concepts. You know context, you know state, you know change events, you know how to call methods or functions on click of buttons. All those things only we have used. Yeah, let me know if you have any doubts in this, or if you did not understood any part, let me know. Now let's take vice versa. Now let's assume I want to share the data from child component to parent component. Then how you will do that? Suppose I have two components, parent component and child component. Till now we have seen how to pass the data from parent to child. Now I want to share the data from child component to parent component. So how to do with props, how to do with context API. So let me close all this. I will create here subfolder called child-parent. Inside this, I will create name dot JSX, and here display dot JSX. And I will create one more home, or I will say something like, yeah, let it be only 2 files right now. Inside name.jsx, let me create one simple component, that's name component. And inside display.jsx, I have display component. Now display component, I want to make as a child of name component. So here simply I will import display component, and here somewhere I will render that display component. And inside this same component, let me take one paragraph. Let me save it. Let me add this BR tag after this paragraph as well. Now this name component I will render inside my app.jsx file. I will comment this and I will render my name component here. Here, if I want, I can just add some padding. Now, if I go back here, I got like this name component, I got display component. Now in my display component, I just want to add simple button. Something like pass data to parent. Now, if I click on this button, somehow the data of display I want to share with name component. So to maintain that data inside my display component, I will create one state. And here simply I will say that child data, comma, set child data equals to use state. So directly I am hard coding the data here. Okay, I am just passing here something called React.js. Inside our display component, now we have one state. Inside that state, we are storing some random data. Now my requirement is the moment I click on this button, this data I want to display inside my parent component. Here I want to display. Here I want to display. The moment I click on this button, whatever data we stored in the state of display component, that data we have to display it. So basically, we are trying to understand how to pass the data from child component to parent component. Now inside the child component, we just created one state. We have one state. Inside that state, we are maintaining some data. We are maintaining some data. and we have one button inside our child component only. We have one button inside our child component. Now, the moment I click on this button, this data we have to give to the parent component. So to pass the data of child component to parent component, we don't have any direct way. We don't have any direct way in React. So for this, we are going to use props concept only. So basically what we are going to do means inside our parent component, okay, inside our parent component, first we will create one state. Inside our parent component, we will create one state. This state we will bind with the JSX of parent component. So what I will do inside my parent component. So in my case, name.jsx file. In this file, we created name component. This is a parent component. Inside this component, I will create one state. Now this state I will bind with my JSX element. So here I have a paragraph. Here I will bind. Now somehow whatever data I have with my child component, that data I should update here. Whatever data I have in my child component. In my child component also I have created one state. In child component also we have one state. Inside that state we have some data. We have some data here. And we have one simple button inside our child component. Now what I need to do is somehow whenever I click on this button, somehow this state data, which is in my child component, somehow that data I should update. Inside my parent component state. Here I should update. If I am able to update my parent component state on click of this button, then whatever data I will have in my parent component state, that data will be displayed in that paragraph. So somehow, whenever I click on this button, this child component state data I have to update inside my parent component state. Now the question is how? So first tell me, if I want to update any data inside this state, how can I update that? How can we update the data inside this state? If you want to update any data inside this state, how you can update it?
We need to render set state.
We have to call set state. Using set state only, we can update that data inside this state. So can I do one thing? This set state, can I give to my child component as a props? This set state function, I will give to my child component as a props. As I have told you, as a props, we can pass anything. We can pass even function. Okay, so that set state I will give to my child component as a props. Now my child component will have that set state. It means that set state will be available to my child component. Now my child component, what it will do? Whenever we click on this button, it will call the set state of parent, and inside that set state, it will pass the data of this child data. It will simply pass the data that we have stored inside our child component. So how to do that? So simply here, I will pass set state equals to set state. Here you can take whatever key you want, but value should be set state only. Here, whatever you want, you can take. I will say that set data. Now this function will be available to your child component. So I will go to this child component here. I will destructure it. Set data. Now this set data is a function type. Now if you are calling set data means internally you are calling set state only. Now whenever I click on this button, now here we cannot call this set data directly like this. It is not allowed in your React. So we have two ways. The first way is you can define one function directly here like this. And inside that, if you want, you can call set data. And now whenever you are calling set data, you have to pass some data. So whatever data I have stored in my child data, that I will pass here. Now, if I go back here, if I click on this button, now see that data got displayed here. So basically what we are doing, whenever we click on this button, which is inside our child component, we are calling one function. This function is called. Internally, this function is calling set data. Now this set data, we are getting as a props. And as the set data, what we are passing? We are passing set state. It means internally you are calling set state only. And to that set state, you are passing some data. Now what set state will do? It will just update that data inside your state. And it will re-render your component. The moment your component is re-rendered, then inside your paragraph, it will display the latest data of this state. And inside this state, the latest data is child data. So that data will be displayed here. So if I click on this, I will get that data. So here, directly we are not passing the data from child to parent. Little bit indirect way we are using. What is that indirect way? We are passing this setter function of our name component to the child component, and that setter function of parent component we are calling in the child component on click of button. So this is how we can use props to share the data from child component to parent component. And this is not a recommended way. Remember, this is not a recommended way. So whenever you want to share the data from child to parent or in between siblings, in between sibling components, then props and context API concepts are not recommended. Props and context API is not recommended. So props and context API is recommended only if you want to share the data from parent to child. For parent to child, it is recommended. But for child to parent, context API and props is not recommended. Then which concept is recommended means if you want to share the data from child to parent or in between siblings, child to parent or in between siblings component, then we go for Redux concept. In this case, Redux concept is more preferable. Using Redux, you can share the data in between siblings. You can share the data from child to parent. Even you can share the data from parent to child. So once you implement Redux in your application, no need to use props or no need of using context API also. Using Redux, you can manage all these three scenarios. Using props also, you can manage all these scenarios. But using props, passing the data from parent to child is easy. But passing the data from child to parent or in between siblings using props is complicated. That's why it is not recommended. Using context API also, we can share the data from parent to child. We can share from child to parent and in between siblings also. But sharing the data from parent to child using context is simple. But sharing the data from child to parent or in between sibling using context is complex. That is why it is not recommended. It is not recommended. Understood, guys? How to share the data from child to parent using props? Yeah. Anyone have any doubts? Yeah. If you don't have any doubts, yeah, you guys can drop. Let's join tomorrow and let's explore next set of things. Okay, so things from here will become little complicated if you want practice, guys. If you want practice, if you want understand, if you want revise, things will be complex for you from here. So make sure you guys are practicing, you guys are revising all your previous concepts. And if you are getting any doubts or if you are not understanding something, feel free to let me know. Okay, feel free to let me know if you're not understanding something. So after the class, go and practice these examples. If you practice, then only you will get doubts. And once you get that doubts, let me know those doubts in tomorrow's session.